Welcome back to Total Drawing. We are drawing part 3 of our realistic portrait drawing project. I'm going to start in the background, and I'm just going to start by laying in patches of medium dark gray, not quite as dark as we can see in the reference in the top right corner of your screen, and I'm going to be blending these strokes in the background together. I'll also erase the grid as I go in segments. I just want to make sure that as I lay in these broad, dark areas in the background, that I do so in layers, and with those layers, I want to change directions. That way, in changing directions, the strokes that I initially lay down in the first layer will sort of melt into or disappear into the second layer. By building up our strokes in different directions, we end up with almost no visible strokes at all. Starting to get a lot darker now. Now, this area in the reference is very dark. In fact, it's black. The graphite is not a black medium, it's a gray medium. So we won't get quite as dark as we can see in the reference in our artwork, but we just want to make sure that we do get very dark. That way there's enough room or range of value left in our graphite pencil to make it to the lights and be able to still spread all of these values apart. So in the hat, it's challenging. There's a pattern to it, and I'm going to start with the darkest areas first. Those are the lower spaces between the ribs of the hat. Now, they're not all the same. They're not the same level of darkness from the ribs on the left to the ribs on the right, and they're not necessarily the same darkness inside of each of these shapes. There's some variety, so be sure that you are looking at your reference all the time. Even if you know what you're drawing, you know it's a hat, you know it has a striped pattern on it, each stripe is unique. So it's important to continuously check your reference. Whether you're working from a photograph like I am, or you're working from life, you want your eyes to be on your reference at least half the time or more. Okay, so the darkest darks are laid into the hat. For the lighter areas, I'm just going to indiscriminately shade over the entire hat. First with a light gray that sort of matches the lightest grays that we can see in the right of the hat. Then I'll go back and gradually start darkening this value on the left side of the hat where the figure is more in shadow. The darkest darks are already there, so I can shade over them without changing them very much. I'm thinking, in this case, I'm thinking of the whole hat as sort of a ball. And a ball has a lighter side and a darker side, and I'm just ignoring the stripes that are on there altogether. We can't forget to look for the form through the pattern. Too often we see a pattern like we see on this hat, and we forget that it's on a rounded surface. It's a hat on a head, and the head is round, and the head needs to be shaded. So when you have a pattern on your person, whether it's their body or their head in this case, don't forget that there's three-dimensionality underneath that pattern. All right, we'll do a little more erasing, and it'll be time to get into the face. Now in the face, I'm going to use a different type of stroke. So far, I've used longer strokes, and I've changed directions to smooth out the visibility of those strokes. But now I'm going to work with circling, tiny circular strokes. So small that the circles that these strokes make are closed circles. And if we move gradually across the face, making our circular strokes, we really won't see any evidence that there are strokes. It'll look relatively smooth. Now the paper that I'm working on is a drawing surface. It's drawing paper. And that means it's a little bit more rough than computer paper, also known as printer paper, or more rough than the composition notebook paper that we're used to writing on. And because of that, we will see a little bit of a pattern, a texture that is actually the texture of the paper. The circling will kind of reveal that, and we'll be able to see it, but it won't play a role in how we interpret or understand the face and the form of the face. So it's going to look pretty smooth, at least as smooth as the tooth of this paper will allow. Circling is a great process to use, pencil shading process, if you do want your artwork to look smooth and you want the values to really feel like they bleed in and out of one another. As you can see around the eye, I've still needed to make some strokes. Some of these little details can't be made with circling. You'll still have to make a longer stroke for some of those. At this point in the face, I'm really just trying to find the shadow, the shape of the shadow, and make it dark-ish, medium gray perhaps, maybe a little bit darker, knowing that I'll go back and darken areas in the shadow. Right now the shadow looks pretty flat, but that's okay. I'm just trying to divide the light from the dark. The face started white. Now I want to divide the light from the dark, and then I can work inside of the darker area looking for more variety. And I can work inside of the lighter area looking for more variety. So we gradually discover all of the values. Maybe just working with 2 or 3 values in the face at first, and then looking for the nuances inside of the shades or inside of the tints. Remember, shades are the dark values and tints are the light values. Speaking of tints, I'm going to work into the tints now. I want to make sure that the edge, in this case, and you can see this in the reference, the edge of the shadow where it meets the light is soft. Okay, this person is outside, but it doesn't look like it's a sunny day. If it were a sunny day, the shadow along the edge of the face where it meets the front of the face would be really sharp and not soft. So pay attention when you're working on portraiture or any other artwork. Pay attention to your edges, not just the edges of your subject, whether the edge of the subject blends in or is blurry where it meets the background, but the edges of your shadows as well. Okay, again in the nose, I will have to make some distinct strokes because there are small details that can almost be represented with a line. And then I'll go back to circling once I get away from the hard-edged detail. So I'm really using 2 pencil shading techniques. They're not entirely different from each other. Blending and circling. I mean, when we're using circling, we're still blending these circular strokes together and also, to some degree, building up the circular strokes in layers until we reach the level of darkness that we desire. We achieve the contrast that we desire. Similar, but not exactly the same. You can use them together. What I'm really trying to achieve is a difference between the skin on the face and everything else. The background, but particularly the hat. I don't want the hat to look quite as even or smooth as the face because it is a different material and it is a slightly more rough material than skin. I'm starting to look for some of those more subtle values now in the tints. Okay, I can't wait to do the little part of the face on the other side of the nose because it's really going to make the nose stand out. There we go. Getting a little bit of darkness next to the highlight that is pretty much the entire bridge of the nose will really help define the nose. There's a lot of small value changes around the mouth. It's important to continue when you're working in and around the features, continue to look at your reference often. The shading around a feature is super important. The eye's not going to look great no matter what you do on the inside of the eye if the shading and the bone structure around the eye isn't defined. Same thing with the mouth or the lips. You know, all of the shading that happens above and below the mouth really create the mouth. we almost have the entire face blocked in. And then we'll just be looking for periodically through the remainder of the artwork subtle differences inside of those broader shapes. And I'm doing that now. I'm going to go ahead and darken the shadow under the bottom lip a little bit, find an even darker value. All right. The tint that is the highlight on the chin is relatively soft. It's not quite as light as a couple of other places in the face. Now the neck is quite dark, and there's not a sharp edge where the jaw meets the neck. So be sensitive to that. Sometimes we represent the side of a nose or a jaw with a sharp line, but more often than not, it's really just an area of shadow, wider than a line. Okay, the face is mostly blocked. It's mostly done. I will probably go in and look for some subtle differences in the shadow side of the face, but I think I want to get into the background now. Do a little erasing and handle the right side of the background very similarly to the left side of the background. So first I'm going to try to carve my figure out of the background where there is contrast up against the figure. And then I'm going to fill this background in layers, in patches, with variable direction to the pencil strokes. Variable directions. It's always easier to shade in a specific direction, the direction that our wrist or elbow wants to bend. So you have to purposefully and intentionally change your directions as you fill in patches, and that is if you're using blending, which are longer strokes built up in layers in different directions with variable pressure. So the patches are almost in place. As you can see, they go in all different directions, and I will go over those patches again with a second set of patches of value, this time just trying to make sure that I don't repeat a specific directional stroke on top of that same direction. I also want the second layer of patches to begin and end around their edges in different places than the first layer, so that those little dark edges that we can see that define each of our patches disappear. It's starting to look smoother now. It's starting to look more even. Now there's something going on in the background on this side. We can see some trees. The trees are not sharp along their edge. They're blurry. They have a soft edge. And so I think circling is a good method, a good technique to use to develop those trees. Keeping the background soft will help the face to look sharper and even more realistic. All right, so the background on the left side is nearly complete, and it's time to work on the leather jacket. So the leather jacket has some really dark accents, and I'm going to actually find those first and then kind of shade over them and soften the edge of some of these dark lines that I've put in so that they become a crease or a fold and not so much a distinct line, but they're going to start as dark lines. I want to be careful with the jacket, but I also want to remember it's not a portrait of a jacket, just like it's not a portrait of a hat. It's okay to spend a little more time in the face than you do in other areas of your artwork. It's okay to create a focal point. If one area of your artwork is a little more clear, that area will be where your viewer's eyes go first. And we want our viewer to understand this is a portrait of a person, not of a jacket or of a hat. It's already a little dangerous with that hat. It's so interesting and attractive to look at because it has a pattern that it could become the focal point. But I like the hat. It's what actually attracted me to the picture in the first place, so I guess that's okay. All right, so we're building up the values in the jacket, and they're very, very dark. In fact, some of the values in the hat are actually darker than you can see that they've been shaded in so far. Remember, this is a gray medium, not a black medium, so your darkest darks will not make it all the way to black. So it's okay if your portrait is generally maybe one step lighter than what you see in your reference when you're shading with graphite. I'm going to leave the jacket slightly lighter than it actually is in the photograph because I think it looks good this way. But it's still generally darker than the face, just like the hat is generally darker than the face. In some ways, the contrast of the face in the photograph is almost too strong. Some of the values in the face don't show up anywhere in the jacket. And so by leaving the jacket and the hat just a slight bit lighter than what we see in the reference, I feel like it harmonizes the values in the clothing with the values in the face. All right, just a last minute detail, and this one is done.